Rain poured down on Ashton, Wyoming, as if the sky itself was drumming on the tin roof of the Maple and Main diner. Red neon lights reflected in the puddles, turning the main street into a trembling mirror. Inside, the smell of dark roast coffee and the hiss of a frying pan created a fragile warmth against the early winter chill. Dan Reeves sat by the window at a table for two. A plate of bacon was growing cold. A cup of black coffee sat untouched, and, as every evening, an empty chair across from him. The door opened. The bell rang, a thin sound like a safety pin. A young woman stepped in, her wet hair clinging to her cheeks, cradling a shivering 6-year-old boy in her arms. "I'm sorry," she said to the waitress, voice hoarse from the cold. "We just need a place to stay until the rain stops." The boy looked around, eyes landing on the empty chair opposite Dan, his gaze curious and longing, as if peeking through the window of a house filled with light. Dan lifted his coffee cup, steam curling into a thin line. He found himself standing before he even realized it, pulling the empty chair out, his hand brushing against the worn wood, polished by years. "You two can sit here," he said calmly. The waitress nodded and hurried off for towels. The woman murmured thanks, sat down, and tucked the boy inside for warmth. Outside, the rain drummed harder. Inside, an empty chair had finally found someone to sit in it. Her name was Emily Carter. She used to work as a kitchen assistant in another town, used to waking at 4 a.m., her hands fluent with flour and butter. But in recent months, her life had turned into a forgotten batch of dough, dry and clumpy. The spark that burned down her quiet home was her ex-husband, violent, controlling, leaving no room for a future. One night she took Noah, her 6-year-old son, and left, carrying a few clothes, an old photograph, and a fragile hope that in a strange town, the two of them could start over. Dan Reeves, 41, was a mechanic at Riverbend Auto down the street. 3 years ago, Hannah, his wife, had passed away. Since then, Dan had lived with the sounds of the workshop, the hammering, the engine hum, the slow country tunes from an old radio. Every night he went to Maple and Main diner, sat in the same spot, and pulled out the same chair, his silent ritual of remembrance. The elderly waitress, Loretta, still refilled his coffee without asking questions. Emily wore a denim jacket with frayed edges. Noah's white sneakers had turned gray. Both were soaked, yet Noah's eyes still glowed as if a fireplace lived in his chest. When Loretta placed bowls of hot chicken soup and buttered bread before them, Emily fumbled through her pockets for coins. Dan just shook his head. "Eat first," he said. There was something about his tone, steady, kind, that made others feel safe, like slipping into a coat that fits just right on a cold night. Under the soft yellow light, the chair opposite Dan, Hannah's chair, was now occupied. Not as a replacement, but as a reminder that a chair was made to be pulled out for someone who needed it. Ashton was a small town, where secrets traveled fast. Tonight, the only secret was that 3 people were sharing warmth. The next day, the rain stopped, and the sky opened in a silver-gray hue, like a blanket washed too many times. Emily took Noah to the town's elementary school to ask about a temporary class. At the door, a few parents looked at them like a problem stepping out of a stranger's car. "Where are you from?" one asked, not cruelly, but sharp enough to cut into pride. Emily smiled and said she'd just moved in. Noah gripped her hand, silent as a polite plea. During lunch break, Dan stopped by Maple and Main to ask Loretta about work. "Butterhorn Bakery's hiring," she said, "but they're picky." Dan nodded and took Emily there. The owner, Mr. Carl, looked over her thin resume, gray eyebrows furrowing. "No reference letter. Current address?" Emily froze. She was staying at a cheap motel on the outskirts. Mr. Carl looked past her, saw Noah sitting with knees hugged tight, and muttered, "This isn't a daycare." By afternoon, rumors had already flown across rooftops. A single mother drifting into town. She sat in Dan Reeves's empty chair. Must be some story there. In small towns, people wash their dirty laundry clean, but hang it in someone else's yard. Emily caught fragments as she passed. Poor thing, but still, why doesn't she go back home? Probably looking for help again. Each word fell heavy on her shoulders, no lighter than the rain from the night before. Noah sat drawing in a corner of the diner, a house with smoke curling from its chimney and a wooden bench out front. "Is this our house?" Dan asked. Noah nodded. "Got a place for me?" The boy nodded harder. Emily turned away, swallowing a sigh. She hated letting Noah see her tired, but it was hard when every door that closed hit louder than a hammer in a garage. That evening, Dan unlocked the empty apartment upstairs in the brick building across from the river. "This used to be Hannah's reading room," he said, brushing dust from the doorframe. From here, you could see the tin roof of Maple and Maine. "If you need a few nights." Emily froze. She was used to kindness with a price. This offer had none. She nodded, then shook her head, then nodded again, her lips trembling because it had been too long since she dared to believe something real. The first night in that apartment was strangely quiet. Emily spread a blanket on the living room floor and put Noah to sleep first. When she stood up to find the light switch, her eyes stopped on the east wall, a wooden oak frame. Inside was a photo of a woman with a gentle, tilted smile and eyes that seemed to listen. Beneath it, an old card read, "Hannah Reeves, volunteer, Ashton Community Clinic." Wind slipped through the crack in the door. Emily touched the card, and a memory surfaced. 10 years ago, in a waiting room of a community hospital 3 states away. A 19-year-old girl had just learned that her mother had passed away. Then, a stranger sat beside her, placed a warm hand over hers, and said, "You're not alone. When you can, pull out a chair for someone else." That woman was Hannah. Emily sank to the floor, tears falling as fast as the rain she'd fled through. The room was still, save for the ticking clock. She called softly, "Dan." Dan stepped in, hand still streaked with grease. Emily pointed to the photo, voice trembling. "I met Hannah once. Back then, in that waiting room, she told me to pull out a chair for someone else." Dan's face froze, then softened like ice meeting sun. He stared at the photo for a long moment, lips mouthing his wife's name. "Hannah always did the small things right," Dan said slowly. "She believed in keeping a chair ready. I think she just pulled one out for me again," Emily whispered, laughing through her tears. The sound of her laughter and sobs intertwined. Music the old walls hadn't heard in years. The next morning, Dan brought a box of waffles Emily had baked in the tiny kitchen to Butterhorn. The scent of butter, cinnamon, and vanilla floated like a sweet argument in her favor. Mr. Carl took a bite, eyes caught between nostalgia and surprise. "Saturday, trial shift, 6 o'clock, he said gruffly. Outside, the first snow began to fall, flakes so thin they felt like blessings. Bit by bit, at Maple and Maine, Dan's table for 2 became a table for 3, then 4 when Loretta added a plate of apple pie, for a good appetite. The once empty chair was no longer a relic of grief. It was an invitation. People spoke of the waffle box, of Noah opening doors for elders, of the quiet mechanic smiling more often. Rumors may travel fast, but sometimes kindness travels faster. That afternoon, as Emily left Butterhorn holding her trial schedule, the cold wind slapped her face, but her heart was warm. They returned to Maple and Maine. Loretta saw the three of them enter, said nothing, just set down another set of silverware and a small cup for Noah. The chatter in the diner fell silent for a beat, as Emily pulled the chair out. The wooden scrape against the tile rang crisp and dry, like an invitation. Stay. A month later, Butterhorn hung a new sign. Now hiring full-time, Emily Carter. Her crusty, soft-centered loaves began appearing on breakfast tables all over town. Each morning, Dan drove Noah to school, his pickup stopping at the corner where the old maple shed its leaves. Noah hopped out, then tapped the truck door twice, a new habit meaning, "Have a good day." Not everyone changed right away. Some still pursed their lips when Emily entered the grocery store. But one snowy afternoon, when the power went out across Ashton, Emily opened Butterhorn, fired up the oven with the backup generator, and handed out free bread and hot soup. Cold hands cupped warm bowls. Wary eyes softened. The same woman who had once whispered gossip now stood in line, and when handed her soup, murmured, "Thank you, Miss Carter." By the end of the season, Dan and Emily had painted the apartment a soft cream color. They hung Hannah's photo where the light was best, beside a polished wooden chair. It was no longer a shrine to sadness, but a corner for gentle memories. On weekend nights, Dan, Emily, and Noah dined at Maple and Maine. Loretta joked she'd label that spot the open chair table, because anyone who walked in lonely could sit down. As for the villain, Emily's ex-husband, he called a few times, sent some messages. Dan and the town sheriff helped her file for a restraining order. He showed up once, saw the patrol lights reflected on Butterhorn's glass door, and left. No shouting. No fights. Between him and Emily now stood an entire town, learning how to open its heart again. A year after that first rainy night, they hosted a community Christmas dinner at Maple and Maine. On the long table, among the roasted chicken and corn, sat an empty chair draped with a hand-embroidered cloth, reading Hannah. Dan raised his glass, eyes wet but voice steady. "Hannah taught me to always keep a chair ready. Tonight that chair belongs to anyone who needs it." The story of Ashton has no fireworks. It smells of baked butter, carries the soft creak of wood as someone pulls out a chair, the sound of snow melting on a collar, and the quiet nods that replace apologies. Kindness rarely shouts. It's small, steady, and repeated, like the way we tie our shoes each morning. Dan pulled out a chair because Hannah once pulled one out for him. Emily did the same because, years ago, in a waiting room, someone sat beside her. And Noah, the 6-year-old boy, learned to hold a door open just a second longer so the person behind him could pass. We never know how far a gesture can travel. An empty chair can become a seat for the first meal after days of hunger. A box of waffles can change a stubborn man's mind. An old photograph can stitch together lives that once seemed unrelated. If Ashton's story touched you, help us pull out more chairs. Like this video, share it with a friend who could use some warmth, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story of kindness. Tell us in the comments. When was the last time you pulled out a chair for someone, or someone did for you? Who knows? Maybe your story will be the small spark that lights someone else's winter.